Well, thank you again so much, Dr. Emmons, Dr. Villacorta, and Bethany Ferguson. We're going to begin a Q&A time together. Unfortunately, Bethany couldn't be with us live today. She is out there in the world helping people as a clinical practitioner. So she had that responsibility, but we're glad that she was able to record that response for us. Want to remind you again to put questions in the Q&A function there and upvote the ones you'd like to see answered, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. Let me begin, Bob, with you. Anything you'd like to respond to from Wilmer or Bethany's responses?
Well, I want to upvote Dr. Villacorta to respond to all the questions that come up, because I can't imagine a more persuasive or compelling or articulate response to anything I said. So that was amazing. Thank you for that. And just judging by the reactions I was seeing in the chat, I'm not alone in that opinion. So very, very powerful.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you, Bob, for such a thorough. I never realized how much I lacked gratitude for what I eat every day. And so it was just very refreshing to be able to connect a spiritual practice as gardening, but I was doing it just for the sake of the experience of being spiritual without any embodiment into the experience of feeling the dirt in your hands. And like somebody was saying in the chat, there's a connection with nature that enriches us and renews us. And that was a discovery for me.
You think we learn something about ourselves when we put our hands in the dirt,
Exactly.
Don't you? I mean, when you think about even just etymologically, when you think about the word for ground, humus, right?
Right.
And humility and humans, there's a connection that goes beyond just the link, in language.
So true, so true. And I think that for me as an academic and a person of words and always talking, feeling the dirt, feeling the mass of water and soil and seeds and the frustration of not seeing them as fast, it was a realization how much entitlement also I had.
Yes.
So that really helped me to deliver myself of that problem, I would say.
Yeah, I had a friend who would plant a garden, but he didn't have the patience for the things to actually grow, the vegetables. So he would see the carrot tops coming out, then he'd pull it out, see how it was doing. And then, of course, it didn't work so after that. But yeah, don't you think we've kind of lost connection with the natural world, right? I mean, we're so divorced from where the source of food comes from. I mean, we've learned a lot more since the pandemic about, supply chains and all of those things.
Right.
We don't grow our own food. We don't sustain ourselves. I mean, a few people do, but not too many. The food comes from the supermarket, right? It doesn't come from the ground. And I think that's what, maybe you're saying. It's harder for us to recognize our debts of gratitude when we don't know where stuff comes from, right? And I don't know how we get that back. I guess you can encourage people to grow gardens, and maybe these community gardens and farmers markets and all of those things can help, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
One thing that occurred to me just a second, it occurred to me when I was listening to Bethany, and she began with kind of a very short grounding exercise, right?
Yes.
Feel yourself in the chair, feel it. And I was immediately flooded with sensation and feeling and this sense again of, I wonder how being connected to the earth as body is also connected to ourselves as bodies. And Wilmer, you just mentioned that, as academics, we live in our heads. We live sort of disembodied lives. And can I get the two of you to vamp on that at all? Is there some connection you think between recognizing our own embeddedness, embodiedness in some ways, and the earth and gratitude?
I think it takes a level of vulnerability to even recognize our need. And I live in my head 24/7. And that for me was an exercise, but it had to be in a place where in quarantine, you couldn't do much, but doing things around the house. So that led me for me to realize how vulnerable I was to a reality that we all experiencing. But it was just the fact that I had to go and start something that I never tried and give up on, because it was so frustrating not to see anything grow. But in that act made me realize how vulnerable I was to my own sense of entitlement that, inhibited my ability to say, thank you, Lord, for all the good things that we can have, even in a pandemic. But so I was, in many ways, I felt totally disconnected with the reality of how much it takes to grow something. So that rooted me into that groundness of creation. I'm part of this thing. So when I read Bob's paper, I thought, wow, I missed so much in so many years that now is part of this connectedness of my soul to something I never explored before as a professor living in my head 24/7.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can do a better job at forging connections between our minds and our bodies and our biological habitats. And I mean, we can all do a little part using whatever influence we have. I mean, I tried to do that in 35 years of teaching when I taught health psychology. And I would, explicitly, as I mentioned in my talk today, draw attention to nature and how it benefits, humans, the restorative, recuperative, from those classic studies of patients in hospitals who looked out at, flowers and trees versus those who looked at the parking structure or a brick wall, right? They healed more quickly. They require less pain-killing medication. They were less a problem, to the hospital staff and all of those things. And we know that people say, well, the location they go when they're feeling stressed or depressed is in nature, is the beach, is the ocean. It's the sorts of things that people put in the chat when I ask them. So, we need to keep that in mind of that. What's the term that the biologist came up with? Biophilia, love of living things, right? Love of nature, right? Just so powerful, built into who we are. And if we can take advantage of that, we can start to, open the door, maybe nudge us in that direction, not just having those nice, warm, fuzzy feelings, but actually doing something with those feelings, right? Which is the whole point of, can we move the needle a bit in terms of making better choices long term if we can activate these emotions, whether it's gratitude, whether it's awe, whether it's wonder, whether it's humility, or the entire package. I think that's the key. But yeah, having a garden. I mean, I grew up and my grandfather we lived 2 houses away, and I spent every day, every summer just in his garden, right? Growing, planting, seeing things grow. And I still, to this day, I can smell a tomato plant in my backyard, and it transports me back to then, 60 years, 50 years ago. I'm not quite that old, 45, 50 years ago, right? And to be able to, have that foundation and be able to give that to my own kids, as we tried to do when they were growing up. And then we would travel through my hometown and we would actually sell the vegetables, driving through neighborhoods. And it's just so cool to have those memories now. So I think that's really, really important, that we can, you see movements of trying to restore that, trying to regain that sense of dependency, on the ground and growing. And if we can do that in a more, I think, concentrated way through education, right, through other means, I think that's a step in the right direction.
Right. It's wonderful. Well, let me get to some of these questions here. There's a question that's been voted up about the way in which climate change has been a source of division within evangelical communities. And the question is, do you have any suggestions for how to engage in a conversation around gratitude for our planet without triggering further division?
Yeah, I mean, we know that's the case, right? That certain groups or ideologies tend to adopt certain issues as theirs, and that makes everyone else, opposed to it, who disagrees. So yesterday I saw the survey that came out. I think it was from the Quinnipiac poll about what people see as the most urgent issues right now, right? And so the independents and conservatives, for them, the important issues are inflation, right? The economy, crime, and immigration. And then climate change, was 5th or 6th, or maybe it wasn't even that high. for the liberals, it was climate change was up there, right? Like pandemic was off the chart for each group. We've moved on from that, even though we're still online. But people don't see that as urgent anymore compared to immigration, compared to crime, compared to inflation, and then climate change. But the hierarchy, the importance look very different in those two groups. And that's the way it's been, with climate change, from the beginning. It has been a very, polarizing political issue. So, and I don't know if that is bridgeable or not. I think that article by Sharif and his co-author, I think it offers some suggestions, and I can't remember everything they said, but they said, if you can find the moral issue that matters to people, no matter what their ideology is, okay, and lean into that, right? That's going to be most critical. So is it, the well-being of future generations? Is it about, seeing oneself as a steward of God's creation, for a person who is, of a Christian theological sensibility? I think if you find that hot button issue or that thing that matters the most to that individual or to that group of individuals, then you can, I think, mobilize some commonality there, as opposed to saying, well, we all live in the same world, we're all interdependent, and all those things are true. But for all the reasons they give in this article, that just doesn't create enough urgency for people, right? It doesn't really, they can't identify with that in a sense of how does that affect my day-to-day behavior.
I was struck by, I think yesterday you put one of your slides in all languages about the word thanks.
Yes.
And as I reflected on your paper and reflected on the lack of grounding in our faith, that even we celebrate the Lord's Supper. I think one common thread for conversation for people of other traditions or positions about this topic is to center ourselves in the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. And the word Eucharist in Greek means given thanks, Eucharisteo. Now, the idea, that would be a common theme that I would talk with anyone across the board and say, when we break the bread and drink the wine, we are being invited to go to the earth, to the fruit that has been, in many ways, put in this context of powerful redemption act of God in the Eucharist. And I don't think there will be even Catholics or Protestants or New Evangelicals, whoever believes in this grounding of the Lord's Supper or communion, whatever they call it, could be a common theme in which we can give thanks for the earth, for the fruit of the wine and wheat that feeds us, but at the same time it connects us with one another.
Yes.
Into giving thanks to God for the beautiful nation, earth that we have, in the same time engaging in conversations in what we're doing to care for it. And if we can translate somehow this Thanksgiving or Eucharist event in our life, in the spiritual life or consciousness, to become and to come to the ground, to the earth, and say, this is God's first language, as Francis of Assisi believed that creation was the first Bible for Christians who couldn't read in the medieval times, where exploitation and education was lacking everywhere. People could just contemplate God's beauty, and that was, I think, Francis of Assisi is also the patron of ecology. I think conversations around that topic, because I believe there are people of non-faith that believe and really admire Francis of Assisi for the work he's done in bringing awareness to the world.
Yeah, I mean, when I partake of the Lord's Supper, I can't help but being just in awe of how many other people at the same time are doing this around the world.
Right.
I mean, if you can even wrap your mind around the fact there's roughly 2 billion Christians, right, and who are at some point weekly, monthly, daily, whatever, re-experiencing Jesus this way. And from the beginning of time, for 2,000 years doing that, you realize you're not alone, right? This is something that really is deep and profound and connects us all. But Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you brought up there. Just finding that connection, the source. And you think of Thanksgiving customs and rituals around the world, whether you're religious or not. There's so many nations and countries and cultures which celebrate food and harvest one way or another, and how that is a really, I think, a good foundational point for moving forward. Just think about gratefulness and responsibility that we have toward each other and toward the future generations.
Well, and Wilmer, I think that's, again, beautiful. It comes back to some things we've talked about the last 2 days about how do you create meaning, and how do you create a narrative within a community. That the Eucharist is one of those rituals, practices that, depending how we narrate it, may communicate this. Let me get to another question here. This is a question, Bob. You've mentioned identity quite a bit. What theoretical approaches do you favor for understanding how beliefs become incorporated into identity, or value-based goals that motivate action?
Mm-hmm. So I think to create sustainable gratitude as a part of one's identity, it has to be based in something which transcends circumstances, vicissitudes, ups and downs of life. I don't know if this is going to make sense in the context of that question, but I think this is the best way that I can come up with it at the moment. When you think about gratefulness as a disposition, as a way of life, okay, and I think about the difference between gratitude as a temporary feeling and gratefulness as a more fundamental life orientation. I think those are two very different things. And I know I haven't made enough of that distinction over these past 3 days. It's one of those things which is in that book that I mentioned by Christy Nelson there. She really focused on gratefulness, living gratefully, despite the fact that you may not feel gratitude at the time. And I think that's just so important, thinking about issues of suffering and meaning, and the extraction of good out of bad, the redemptive twist that takes place when something bad can turn into something good. If you see it through a lens of gratefulness, you say, okay, what's the opportunity in the situation, right? What is the situation presenting me with that potentially I can feel gratitude as a feeling, even though there's nothing to be grateful about in the moment. So if I have that as a deeper life orientation, that helps me, deal with the suffering, deal with the trials and tribulations and all the bad things that I'm going through. But I need a worldview which is strong enough to sustain that. That the shoulders are broad enough, to handle that. I mean, and for me, it's God's love, right? For me, and I was asked to preach once at Westmont to all the students, right? So I mentioned yesterday I get asked to preach once in a while. So actually it's 3 times in my life. It hasn't been that many, but one of those was to Westmont students, and all 1,200 students. And what I left them with, I said, okay, this is the only time I'm going to talk to you, so this is my big chance, right? I share with them my favorite scripture, which was Romans 8:38-39, right? Nothing's going to separate us from the love of God, right? Which is Christ Jesus. Nothing, the scripture, right? I said, if I hold on to that truth, that there's nothing I can do to lose God's love, because there's nothing I could do to earn God's love in the first place. It's quite independent about me, right? It's quite, one way, right? It's not based on anything I've done. And so if I remember that, if I ground my gratitude in that becomes part of my identity. That becomes part of who I am. I am, what Christ has done for me. I am what God has done for me, the person of Christ. That sustains me. That gives me reason for gratitude. That gives me reason for my gratitude, informing other decisions I make, whether it's about the environment, or about how I raise my kids, or about how I teach my classes, or what I choose to do in my neighborhood or my town. I have a foundation that hopefully is enough to withstand vicissitudes of life, no matter what life is throwing at us.
It's great. It's great. I want to just follow something up there for a second before I go to another question. And again, I'm struck with how easy it is for us to talk about gratitude in very individualistic ways. Mm-hmm. Gratitude for me, or my gratitude. But I'm wondering about gratitude for a community, or gratitude of a community. That maybe we practice gratitude for the good of the community. Maybe the community practices gratitude in such a way that sustains individuals when they can't practice gratitude. I'm wondering, what that might have to say about collectivist cultures. I'm also wondering what that has to say again about the body of Christ. You have thoughts on that, either of you?
I've been thinking about when you said that the word Ubuntu in South African, and it's used in South Africa as a way to, which means I am because we are. So there is this sense of connection between a person and a community. And this is so foreign to us as North American Westerners, that we live in the individualistic view of our relationships, our spirituality, our practice. That I think personally, I've been instructed and educated by my African students coming to our degree programs, where they invite us to go beyond just having small groups and talk into a life of community in which we exchange stories of joy, sorrow, victory, and defeat. And that creates a sense of a community that is, I've never seen. I mean, I've seen it in the classroom with students around, especially our students that come with this sense of collective consciousness, that we can talk about our suffering, we can talk about our vulnerabilities, and we can open about each other stories in the service of God in the kingdom. So those are ideas that come to me when I think about how we have secluded, I would say, our ability to connect with others. And this is what reading Bob's paper on the many cultures that are really celebrating gratitude to the creation by its goods and provisions, that I realized this is the way we're connected with other humans, that are able to realize that they're not living in the same context we are in North America, but they are connected with this sense of, wow, we need to give back in thanks to the earth, to what we are consuming from. And so I think that would be something that we need as people in the West, to invite others from different cultures and to help us to divest ourselves from our individualism that is consuming us.
Yeah, I can think of a couple of examples from my own life. So I think it was around 2008, the city of Burbank, not too far from you, Brad, and your colleagues. The city of Burbank they had a year-long program they developed, a year-long campaign. They wanted to become the most grateful city in America. Oh, that's kind of cool, right? So that takes certainly out of the individual context. So they were doing things. They were like coming up with the world's longest gratitude list. So they had these big, huge rolls of paper. They were going through the sidewalks, and everyone was writing what they were grateful for. That was just one thing. They had, activities and events, planned throughout the town. I came down and gave a talk. They had an author who had done interviewed some Hollywood people about what they're grateful for, and he had just published a book. So that was a big deal. And so that they got everyone focused, as much as possible, at least on the topic of gratitude for that entire year. So now, did that move the needle for it? Probably did in some respects, and I'm sure it was transformative for a lot of people in that particular community. So that was very cool. And then at UC Davis, we have an annual community book project so there's a committee every year that gets together and reviews various books that have been nominated for the entire, basically it's designed for the entire community to read this book and to come together, to have discussions, to have courses, seminars, workshops, speakers. The author of the book comes in once a year, that big event at the Mondavi Performing Arts Center. A few years ago, I was able to get on the committee, and the book that we chose was the Book of Joy by the Dalai Lama and the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I thought, well, first of all, a lot of us wanted that book, but we had to work hard at it because everyone had their own interest. I thought, the Book of Joy, how great would that be for community building, right? Given that, you're familiar with that book, it's all about, connection, right? Compassion, generosity, forgiveness, Gratitude, of course, figures in there as well. But I thought, that's what we need. We know because college campuses, there's separation, right? There's not a sense of unity in your average community, right? In your average university. Okay, I mean, we're all professors. We have our own individual, lives and empires and research units and that sort of thing. And there's not a lot of coming together, a lot of sharing. And so I thought this would be a great thing, and it's good for the mental health of students, which we know is, a big problem all around the country and around the world, for that matter. And so that was a beautiful thing to see. So that certainly got it, above and beyond the individual level, at least for that year. So those sorts of things, I think, can work and can be very powerful and make a difference.
Yeah, that's great. It's great. Let me shift here a little bit to a question. Begins with thank you, wonderful presentation. When you spoke about gratitude helping with a lot of world issues such as racism, I'm wondering if you could expand on this. More specifically, do you think this is a reciprocal relationship of gratitude? Where should the oppressed or victims of racism or systemic racism find gratitude in their circumstances? How can they be grateful to or for their oppressors? It's a tough question.
Yes, it is. So thanks for that. A good way to wrap up the week, right? So I don't think you are grateful for oppression. I mean, as I mentioned the other day, that when you're grateful in all circumstances is very different than grateful for those circumstances. There's certain things we are not going to be grateful for. The question for me, sitting here very comfortably in my office day after day and so forth, is, well, it's easy to say, can we find opportunities or possibilities in these situations, no matter how painful and how unwanted they are? And, where does the power of gratitude shine a light? Is it, as I said, I don't think it's just a switch we turn on when life is going well. It's also a light that can shine in the darkness. So can we find support? Can we find hope? Can we find possibilities? And I think, someone like Alexis Abernathy can speak much more persuasively and compellingly, and from a point of view, both personally and professionally, in what she's examined, and what people have gone through. And gratitude has helped in the healing response in those settings, in those contexts and so forth. But, I do think that, to say that gratitude has no bearing in situations like this, I don't think that is correct either. But obviously, one is not going to be grateful for these very difficult and oftentimes desperate situations. We do know that there's a mixture of life that, people feel conflicting emotions all the time, even outside these, extreme contexts, that when a person has helped and harmed me and I've suffered, but also they've benefited me, how does that play out, psychodynamically? I think that's a very fascinating issue that I don't think has fully, been appreciated in the work on gratitude, and certainly some of the clinical work, which is just really starting on gratitude, in the therapy room. How does it, hook up with things like forgiveness and accountability and, justice? And I think these are very, very important issues that, will require a lot more work from more than just psychologists with their questionnaires and interview techniques, to looking at a much broader societal level. Mm-hmm. But I do think gratitude is something which is available to everyone. And I think that's part of the beauty for me, is that you're never too young, too old, too rich, too poor, too healthy, too sick, too whatever, to experience gratitude. And to say that people can't have gratitude, even though they've been through difficult times, really is dismissive of them, really underestimates what they're capable of. And that's one of the big lessons I've learned from my own studies of gratitude, is that people have been through terrible situations. They've been, victims of abuse. They've had addictions and afflictions of various sorts. I hear from prison inmates who write to me and they say they found healing in gratitude. And that inspires me to keep going forward with this work and find people like that. How do they do, and how can we learn from them? How can they be role models? Is why I continue to do what I do. So thank you for that good question, which I didn't answer, but it inspired me to have some of these thoughts.
Wilmer, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, it's a tough one. Again, I go back to the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. In an act of humility and transparency, vulnerability, Jesus broke the bread and gave thanks. That act for me is kind of the moment where nothing that I have experienced in suffering is compared to anything that has been done in slavery in this country, especially in this country. that can minimize. But I believe personally, what I've read, understood, the slave humans were able to experience the presence of God even in their bondage, recalling, and once they were able to grasp the illustrations of the scriptures, that there was power in their suffering, and someday they will be free. I think I cannot conceive their response to that act of faith without gratitude, even though it's easy for us people now in the 21st century, people that have not had that experience in their generations to say thank you. But I feel that racism is the distortion of power to its lowest, in which deprives people from freedom to live and to breathe and to touch the earth without the punishment of work that they sense. So I go back to the Eucharist, the act of God in Christ, who broke the bread and gave thanks, that he was facing the hard moment in life to face the cross. And I think that should give us hope, that in gratitude we can find power to overcome our fears, our own wounds, and to look at the one who gave up everything and who gave thanks for what was coming for him. So I think there's more to unpack there. So, but I hope that this helps us to reconcile our sense of entitlement, even about what we eat, what we touch with our hands every day, and how we can have new venues, new avenues for conversation about this topic of gratitude. So it's been really enriching for me.
Thank you. Well, we're at the end, and I want to thank you, Dr. Emmons, and you, Dr. Villacorta, and earlier who heard from Bethany Ferguson. But Bob, I just want to give you a last chance to say anything before I make my final announcements. Any last words for us?
This has been an amazing 3 days, and I have to say that. So years ago, over 20 years ago, I was given a task. I was given a charge by Sir John Templeton, who is the sponsor of pretty much all the research at the Templeton Foundations in the science and practice of gratitude. And he said to me at a conference, that Dr. Emmons, how can we get 7 billion people around the world to practice gratitude? I mean, he thought it was that important. Actually, 6 billion was the population at the time. Now it's 7 billion, you know? And so he believed it was that important to human flourishing and to the future of humanity. And I'm only one person. I can only do so much. I'm glad so many other people have come alongside now from the sciences, from philosophy, from theology, from pastoral work, and continue to, you know, maybe at some point, you know, we can get pretty close to that 7 billion. And if we don't, we'll certainly do our best because, you know, we need more of it, obviously, for all the reasons why we discussed over these last 3 days. So thanks for having me on and the chance to just, you know, share some of what I've learned about this amazing concept.
Yeah, so we are very grateful to you, and thank you for the work you've done, and for the way you've invited other scientists and researchers and theologians and philosophers keep thinking about all these things. So all of those of you listening out there, keep up this good work.